"Why did you want to catch up with the three women?" Sampson asked. Tate shrugged. "Just crazy daydreams. The mother was attractive, early 40s. Obviously, they all liked to hike. I thought maybe we could hike together for a while. That's pretty common on the AT. "Anybody else you saw that day?" Sampson asked. "I don't remember anybody unusual. I'll keep thinking. I have the time in here, and the motivation." "All right, so there were the families, the elderly couple, the mother and her two daughters. Any other groups you saw on the trail? Males hiking together? Any single hikers?" He shook his head. "No, I don't remember seeing anybody suspicious. Didn't hear any unusual noises during the night. I slept well. That's one benefit of hiking. Got up the next morning, hit the road by 7:30. It was a beautiful day, clear as a bell, and you could see for miles. The police came and arrested me about noon." Reverend Tate looked at me. His small eyes were pleading, searching for understanding. "I swear I'm innocent. I didn't hurt anybody in those woods. I don't know how I got blood on some of my clothes. I didn't even wear those clothes the day those poor people were murdered. I didn't kill anybody. Somebody has to believe me." His words chilled me through and through. Sergeant Ellis Cooper had said virtually the same thing. Chapter 48. My last case as a homicide detective. A real tricky one. I'd been thinking about it pretty much non-stop for the past few days, and it weighed on my mind during the numbing ride home from Harper's Ferry, West Virginia. I still hadn't given notice at work. Why not? I continued to take on homicide cases in D.C., though most weren't challenging. A small-time drug dealer had been killed in the projects, but nobody cared. A 20-year-old woman had killed her abusive husband, but it was clearly in self-defense. At least to me it was clear. Ellis Cooper was dead. And now a man named Reese Tate was accused of murders that he probably didn't commit. That weekend I used frequent flyer miles to take a flight out to Tempe, Arizona. I'd scheduled a meeting with Susan Etra, whose husband had been convicted of murdering a gay enlisted man. Mrs. Etra was suing the Army for wrongful death. She believed that her husband was innocent and that she had enough evidence to prove it. I needed to find out if Lieutenant Colonel James Etra might have been framed for murder, too. How many victims were there? Mrs. Etra answered her front door and seemed very uptight and nervous. I was surprised to see a poker-faced man waiting in the living room. She explained that she had requested her lawyer be present. Great. The lawyer was darkly tan, with slicked-back white hair, an expensive-looking charcoal gray suit, black cowboy boots. He introduced himself as Stuart Fisher from Los Angeles. "In the interest of possibly getting to the truth about her husband's wrongful arrest and conviction, Mrs. Etra has consented to talk with you, Detective. I'm here to protect Mrs. Etra." "I understand," I said. "Were you Lieutenant Colonel Etra's lawyer at his trial?" I asked. Fisher kept his game face. "No, I wasn't. I'm an entertainment attorney. I do have experience with homicide cases, though. I started in the DA's office in Laguna Beach. 6 years down there." Fisher went on to explain that Mrs. Etra had recently sold her husband's story to Hollywood. Now I was the one who had to be careful. For half an hour or so, Susan Etra told me what she knew. Her husband, Lieutenant Colonel Etra, had never been in any trouble before. As far as she knew, he'd never been intolerant of gays, men or women. And yet he had supposedly gone to the home of 2 gay enlisted men and shot them dead in bed. At the murder trial, it was alleged that he was hopelessly in love with the younger of the 2 men. "The murder weapon was an Army service revolver. It was found in your home? It belonged to your husband?" I asked. Jim had noticed that the revolver was missing a couple of days before the murder. He was very organized and meticulous, especially when it came to his guns. Then suddenly the gun was conveniently back in our house for the police to find. Lawyer Fisher apparently decided I was harmless enough and left before I did. After he was gone, I asked Mrs. Etra if I could take a look at her husband's belongings. Mrs. Ettra said, "You're lucky that Jim's things are even here. I can't tell you how many times I've thought about bringing his clothes to a local charity group like Goodwill. I moved them into a spare bedroom. Far as I've gotten." I followed her down the hall to the room. Then she left me alone. Everything was neat and in its place, and I had the impression this was how Susan and James Ettra had lived before murder and chaos had destroyed their lives. The furniture was an odd mix of blonde wood and darker antiques. A war table against one wall was covered with collectible pewter models of cannons, tanks, and soldiers from various wars. Next to the models were a lot of guns in a locked display case. They were all labeled. 1860 Colt Army revolver, 44 caliber, 8-inch barrel. Springfield trapdoor rifle, cartridge, used in the U.S. Indian Wars. Has original bayonet and leather sling. Marlin rifle, circa 1893, black powder only. I opened the closet next. Lieutenant Colonel Ettra's clothes were divided between his civvies and Army uniforms. I moved on, checking the various cabinets. I was rummaging through the drawers of a highboy when I came upon the straw doll. My stomach tightened. The creepy doll was the same kind I'd found at Ellis Cooper's place outside Fort Bragg. Exactly the same, as if they'd been bought at the same place, by the same person, the killer. Then I found the watchful, lidless eye in another drawer of the highboy. It seemed to be watching me, vigilant, keeping its own nasty secrets. I took a deep breath, then went outside and asked Mrs. Ettra to come to the room. I showed her the straw doll and the all-seeing eye. She shook her head and swore she'd never seen either before. Her eyes revealed her confusion and fear. "Who was in my house? I'm sure that doll wasn't here when I moved Jim's things," she insisted. "I'm positive. How could they have gotten here? Who put those dreadful things in my house, Detective Cross?" She let me take the doll and the eye with me. She didn't want them around, and I couldn't blame her. Chapter 49. Meanwhile, the murder investigation continued on another front. John Sampson turned his black Mercury Cougar off Route 35 in Mantoloking on the Jersey Shore and headed in the general direction of the ocean. Point Pleasant, Bay Head, and Mantoloking were connecting beach communities, and since it was October, they were fairly deserted. He parked on East Avenue and decided to stretch his legs after the drive up from Washington. "Jesus, what a beach," Sampson muttered under his breath as he walked up a public-access stairway and reached the crest of the dunes. The ocean was right there, less than 40 yards away, if that. The day was just about perfect. Low 70s, sunny, cloudless blue sky, the air unbelievably clear and clean. Actually, he thought, it was a better beach day than people got for most of the summer, when all these shore towns were probably jammed full of beachgoers and their transportation. He liked the scene stretching out before him a lot. The quiet, pretty beach town made him feel relaxed. Hard to explain, but recently his days on the job in D.C. seemed tougher and more gruesome than usual. He was obsessing about Ellis Cooper's death, his murder. His head was in a real bad place lately. That wasn't true here, and it had happened instantly. He felt that he could hear and see things with unusual clarity. He figured he'd better get to work, though. It was almost 3:30, and he had promised to meet Billy Houston at her house then. Mrs. Houston's husband had allegedly killed another soldier at nearby Fort Monmouth. The victim's face had been painted white and blue. "Let's do it," he told himself, as he opened a slatted gate and walked toward a large brown-shingled house on a path strewn with seashells. The beach house and the setting seemed almost too good to be true. He even liked the sign, "Paradise Found." Mrs. Houston must have been watching for him from inside the beach house. As soon as his foot touched down on the stairs, the screen door swung open, and she stepped outside to meet him. She was a small African-American woman, and more attractive than he'd expected. Not movie star beautiful, but there was something about her that drew his attention and held it. She was wearing baggy khaki shorts with a black t-shirt and was barefoot. "Well, you certainly picked a nice day for a visit," she said and smiled. Nice smile, too. She was tiny, though, probably only 5 feet tall, and he doubted that she weighed much more than 100 pounds. "Oh, it isn't like this every day?" Sampson asked, and managed to smile himself. He was still recovering from being surprised by Mrs. Houston as he mounted her creaking wooden porch steps. "Actually," she said, "there are a lot of days like this one here. I'm Billy Houston, but of course you knew that." She put out her hand. It was warm and soft in his, and small. He held her hand a little longer than he'd meant to. Now, why had he done that? He supposed it was partly because of what she'd been through. Mrs. Houston's husband had been executed nearly 2 years earlier, and she proclaimed his innocence loudly and clearly until the end, and then some. The story felt familiar. Or maybe it was because there was something about the woman's ready smile that made him feel comfortable. She impressed him about as much as the town and the fine weather had. He liked her immediately. Nothing not to like. Not so far, anyway. "Why don't we walk and talk on the beach?" she suggested. "You might want to take off your shoes and socks first. You're a city boy, right?" Chapter 50. Sampson did as he was told. No reason the murder investigation, this interview anyway, couldn't have a few nice perks. The sand felt warm and good against his bare feet as he followed her down the length of the big house, then up and over a tall, broad dune covered with white sand and waving beach grass. "Your house sure is something else," he said. "Beautiful doesn't begin to do it justice." "I think so," she said, and turned to look back at him with a smile. "Of course, this isn't my house. My place is a couple of blocks inland. One of the small beach bungalows you pass driving in. I house-sit for the O'Briens while Robert and Kathy are in Fort Lauderdale for the winter." "That's not such bad duty," he said. Actually, it sounded like a great deal to him. "No, it's not bad at all." She quickly changed the subject. "You wanted to talk to me about my late husband, Detective. Do you want to tell me why you're here? I've been on pins and needles since you called. Why did you want to see me? What do you know about my husband's case?" "Pins and needles?" Sampson asked. "Who says pins and needles anymore?" She laughed. "I guess I do. It just came out. Dates and locates me, right? I grew up on a sharecropper's farm in Alabama, outside Montgomery. Not giving you the date. So, why are you here, Detective?" They had started down a sandy hill sloping toward the ocean, which was all rich blues and greens and creamy foam. It was unbelievable. Hardly a soul up or down the shoreline. All of these gorgeous houses, practically mansions, and nobody around but the seagulls. As they walked north, he told Mrs. Houston about his friend, Ellis Cooper, and what had happened at Fort Bragg. He decided not to tell her about the other murders of military men. "He must have been a very good friend," she said when Sampson had finished talking. "You're obviously not giving up easily." "I can't give up. He was one of the best friends I ever had. We spent 3 years in Vietnam together. He was the first older male in my life who wasn't just out for himself. You know, the father I never had." She nodded, but didn't pry. Sampson liked that. He still couldn't get over how petite she was. He had the thought that he could have carried her around under his arm. "The other thing is, Mrs. Houston, I am totally convinced that Ellis Cooper was innocent of those murders. Call it a sixth sense or whatever, but I'm sure of it. He told me so just before they executed him. I can't get past that. I just can't." She sighed, and he could see the pain on her face. He could tell she hadn't gotten over her husband's death and how it had happened, but she still hadn't intruded on his story. That was interesting. She was obviously very considerate. He stopped walking, and so did she. "What's the matter?" she finally asked. "You don't talk about yourself easily, do you?" he asked. She laughed. "Oh, I do. When I get